of reading on Abraham Lincoln.
Sure.
And of course, Lincoln, wasn't it Byron? You read a lot of Byron or some poets. You picked up these books wherever you could. I guess they weren't really easy to get, but poetry, I think, played a considerable part in his thinking and progression and whatever.
Well, sure, you have that whole kind of almost silent exchange between he and Whitman, right? I mean, Lincoln was the great redeemer president for Whitman. And Lincoln was familiar with the work of Whitman, and when Whitman was in D.C., they would pass one another and kind of, nod to each other. They knew who each other were, so you're absolutely right. And isn't it interesting, we talk about the kind of relationship between, say, poetry and politics. If you remember during the last election, this was when Hillary Clinton was more in the adversarial role against Barack Obama, right? And she says, well, referring to his oratory skill, we make speeches in poetry, but we govern in prose, thereby reinforcing the notion that poetry is an impotent, politically and socially unengaged phenomenon that is just for rhetorical purposes and has no value outside that kind of sphere of chicanery, bamboozling, propagandizing. And I mean, that's how I took it. And isn't it also interesting that I recently came upon that whole business of yes, we can, we are who we are the ones we've been waiting for, right? He wholesale lifted that from the black poet June Jordan, never giving her attribution for that, so far as I know. And isn't it kind of interesting that it kind of poetry wove itself into the political discourse?
Lincoln's speeches they're like poetry.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there was a time when people believed in the capability, and Whitman, there again, was deeply believed that the poets would be the common referees of society and that it would have a political function. So somewhere along the line, I don't know precisely, I do have some theories about that. I would say kind of modernist poetry, that in many ways is utterly unintelligible, has become an institutionalized form that is largely taught in the schools. So therefore, of course, students are going to be upset with the fact, as any reasonable person would, if you're constantly brushing up against something that you can't make meaning out of, that you can't engage with or connect with, you're going to despise it. It's going to make you feel less than your full capability and potential. So you have that kind of great schism of the poets of the Whitmanian tradition, on the one side, who are of, by, for the people, wanting to engage and communicate, very much of the tradition of Lincoln. And then you have the Eliot School, the institutional Ivy Leagueism of almost incoherency in a lot of ways, unintelligibility. And that has become the poetics that has been celebrated, rewarded, and advanced as part of a curriculum. Whitman is generally not taught as Whitman. You may get a smidgen of what his poetics were, but the real Whitman, it never really kind of comes out in the school system because it's too controversial. We can't have a radical egalitarian society where all people are equal. And, that's part of, so I mean, that's about the shortest way I can answer that question. Yeah.
What or who spurred your interest in poetry? Was it a teacher, family?
Wow. It's a very, I'll just try to boil it down because it's a convoluted story. For whatever reason, and I don't know exactly where it came from, but I had a kind of a natural aptitude for English, and yet I hated in high school to read. And I was one of the same kids. It's like karma is a real SOB, right? Because now the kids that I'm teaching are very much, I'm like looking at myself and trying to get them to be motivated about reading. And it was just one of these things that I was a music student, a musician, had literally all my eggs in one basket. And in high school, going into college initially, as a music major, I over-practiced myself to the point where I did actual damage to my hands. I have what's known as like pronator syndrome. It's not carpal tunnel, but like if I do this too much or I'm trying to grab something with my hand, my forearm will go numb. And it kind of pinches off the median nerve. So I had to kind of give that up. And my ex-girlfriend at the time said, well, I had to kind of figure out what I was going to do for a major. And she said, well, you seem to be pretty good at writing. You have kind of a thing for that. And I went into that kind of path, and I had a poetry instructor who I'm still in contact with, named Jim Scrimger, who wrote the introduction for my Solitary, Poor, Nasty, Brutish, and Short book. He teaches at Western Connecticut State University. And he rescued me in a lot of ways because though I did drop out of college at that point in my life, he was the first one to take notice. And I was a punk at that time. I was blowing off classes. I was not committed as a student at all. But I came to his office one day, and I'll never forget it, he looked at what I had written, and he kind of just stepped back a little bit. And he very much took me under his wing and encouraged me to keep doing this. And so I did. And it wasn't always that I was consistent with it. So it was a 6-year hiatus in that period where I did nothing. I didn't even think about it. But if it wasn't for Jim Scrimger, I probably would have never continued on. As far as poetic influences above and beyond that, Allen Ginsberg was a huge influence. I just love his use of creativity with language. And then tracing Whitman out of that whole experience, became a big fan of Whitman. And then Martina Spada is a big influence on my work today. So that's about the shortest answer. That's how it kind of came about. It was a very circuitous path. It was not pre-planned, and it was more or less somebody kind of prompted me to think about it because I was just too ignorant to see the forest for the trees myself. Yeah?
So in your case, there was a correlation there between music and writing. Did you see a correlation, a natural correlation between, like, even the meters of music and poetry?
Yeah, I definitely do see, and I have to remember, I forgot Mike had asked me to repeat the question so that we could hear them. So the question was, do I see essentially a correlation between, say, the orality of and kind of the metrical and rhythmic aspects of music and language, right? Yes, I definitely do, and I think it's one of those things, the hardest thing to teach a poet or a writer to do is to develop a natural sense of musicality and language. I think hands down, I think you can probably teach all other aspects, but that's something that is almost inherent. I think it's difficult to manufacture that. So yeah, I think that some of the best poetry to me involves thinking about language as a form of music. So yeah, absolutely, and it doesn't always happen, but.
Well, I think, thinking what you said here, what you're talking about was in 1960s, I'm old enough to remember that, of course, and if you read or listen to some of John Lennon's music, it seems like it's got all kinds of poetry in it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you look closely at lyrics, and poetry is a lyrical form in a lot of ways. It's often referred to, there again, song of myself. We go back to, there is this connection between music and poetry that's been long-standing, very long-standing. And so a lot of times what I do when I'm teaching younger people about poetry, this demonized, marginalized, impotent thing, right? I tell them, yeah, the music, because most of them are involved in listening to music, and most of it has lyrics. And I say, look closely at the lyrics, and you can use the lyrics as part of a found poem, let's say, to incorporate as poetic inspiration for yourself. So yeah, I'm constantly, I listen to a lot of music. I use allusions to music and to film and to other types of medium in my work all the time. So to me, it's music and poetry go together like peanut butter and chocolate. I don't know. I can't think of a more kind of a poetic comparison. I don't know. It's just those are two things that belong together, and they're part of the same kind of discourse to me. You have any other questions? Or you want me to read another couple poems?
There was another, wasn't Allen Ginsberg, wasn't he a poet that sort of led the revolt in the 60s?
Sure. Yeah, and he was, and Ginsberg himself wrote music. I think his music was terrible, actually, but that's just my